Next, we're going to have a presentation from Scott Pringle. You're recognized.
Good morning.
Good morning, Scott Pringle with WSP. Thank you for the opportunity to give you the progress update on the Regional Rapid Transit project. Quickly, I don't need to remind anybody here, but the focus of the project itself is to provide all-day, modern and frequent, reliable service that connects our region, that connects those major activity centers, and that's the goal we're trying to accomplish through this project, through the PD&E. Now, today I come and present some recommendations for conclusion of our first milestone. So we're making great progress. We're working through those 5 milestones which I've described previously. And the whole intent of this first milestone was to begin addressing those questions that we heard from the earlier planning phase, which is how many stations are there, how much of the corridor is dedicated. We had a great conversation at our last meeting in relationship to the number of station areas that we're looking at in the project. And today we're going to talk a little bit about 5 different alternatives that we'd like to carry into milestone 2, which we can start developing our design concepts, getting into some of those details. So now we can start looking under milestone 2, we can start looking at what types of stations are we actually talking about. Is it something that's in the interstate, or is it something that's at street level? In regards to the alignment in the corridor itself, is it on the outside of the interstate, or is it the inside shoulder of the interstate? So now we get to start talking about those details, digging a little bit deeper as we move into milestone 2. Quick reminder as to what we discussed at the last board meeting. Had a great conversation about identifying what were our priorities from a station perspective in relationship to the 21 that were proposed out of the planning phase. Had a significant amount of technical work over the past several months to identify those priorities. We met with a lot of your stakeholders and had great conversations about those priorities. I won't go too much deep into detail, but remind the board today that the stations that we're looking at moving forward are those that are listed here on the map. So from top to bottom, we're looking at State Route 54, State Route 56, Bears Avenue, USF or Fowler Avenue, Watersburg. We're still evaluating a potential 13th station, which could potentially be a solution for connection to the Tampa Seminole Heights area. Outside of that, downtown Tampa, Himes Avenue, West Shore, Gateway Carillon area, 62nd Avenue, Tropicana Field, and 4th Street. So those are the 12, possibly 13 stations that we'd like to move forward into milestone 2. So what I'd really like to discuss with the board today are those 5 alternatives. So we're going to use those 13 station areas, 12 to 13 station areas, and now we're going to start looking at the alternatives and how we move that into our initial design concepts. But before I do that, I do want to go through a couple of important terms as we're discussing these different alternatives. For example, there's been a lot of conversation about bus on shoulder. So operating a bus service on the shoulder of the interstate that's tied to the speed of the travel in the general purpose lanes, so automobile traffic. So the thinking right now within the state of Florida is that a bus can use the shoulders if the travel speeds in the general purpose lanes are slower than 35 miles per hour. So that's the definition of bus on shoulder. That is not recognized by FTA as a dedicated transit lane. The different terms that are recognized by FTA as a dedicated transit lane are business access and transit lanes. For example, we're actually looking at a potential for implementing these BAT lanes for the Central Avenue BRT in St. Pete. That's where you have a lane that you can have vehicles that can turn through that lane to get access to a business, but it's primarily dedicated for transit service. Now, when we're talking about dedicated lanes on the interstate, which is pertinent to this particular project, to be compliant with the FTA dedication or terminology for a dedicated lane, it can actually operate in the exact same space we're talking about with the bus on shoulder. The difference is that space is made available for that bus service throughout the day, and it's not tied to the speeds of the travel in the general purpose lanes, the automobile traffic. So, like I said, it can happen in the exact same geographic space. It's just how it's used, and the FTA requirement is that it's used throughout the day, especially during peak periods of travel. So with that, we're going to go through the different 5 alternatives that we'd like to carry into milestone 2 and open that up for discussion to the board today. First and foremost, this is an FTA requirement. It also is required by federal law when you're looking at environmental compliance. We have to identify what is our baseline. So what are we looking at opening day for this transit project without any investment whatsoever in the project itself? And what we're assuming is that the Tampa Bay Next Highway Interstate Modernization Program is in place when we're looking at building this particular project. And I do want to recognize that the amazing work that the department has done in providing provisions for transit even within TB Next. So they are actively looking at adding hardened shoulders, which will allow the availability for bus on shoulder in TB Next without this project whatsoever. So we're using that as our baseline, as a point of comparison, as we start evaluating the following 5 alternatives. Now, and I do want to just quickly remind the board here that that bus on shoulder capability, while it's an amazing opportunity for a provision for transit on the interstate, it again is not going to meet the FTA standards for a dedicated lane for the FTA Capital Investment Grant Program. Now, alternative 1 is working from that no build, but what FTA likes to see, generally speaking, is what they call TSF&O alternative, or basically sort of a baseline alternative in which you can make comparisons where you have very little investment in capital infrastructure. So what we're doing is saying our first alternative for that point of comparison is using the infrastructure that's being provided through TB Next by the states, but putting some investment into the stations along the corridor, which is different or varies from that no-build alternative. And again, these 2 are required. They're a point of comparison so that we can evaluate the next 4 alternatives. So alternative 2 is, and again, a reminder that that's not eligible for the FTA Capital Investment Grant Program. Alternative 2 is the recommendation that came out of the planning phase, which now we're starting to look at some dedicated lanes. It could be in that same shoulder, that same conversation about bus on shoulders, but again, now that space is available throughout the day for dedicated transit. And with this alternative, we've got dedicated lanes in Pinellas through the majority of Hillsborough County, and then at the major interchanges in Pasco. We are going to be compliant with the FTA program, the Capital Investment Grant Program, and we're looking at approximately about 60% of the corridor being that dedicated transit lane. So that will be alternative 2. Now, alternative 3, so as we go through alternative 3, 4, and 5, you'll notice that as we came out of the planning phase, we did have a lot of conversation about essentially what a lot of folks identified as potential gaps in what was dedicated, which is the Howard Franklin Bridge and that conservation land in North Hillsborough County as you make your way up to about County Line, Pasco County Line. So the following 3 alternatives are addressing those questions. Just like I mentioned, that was the whole purpose of milestone 1. So alternative 3 is looking at what are the benefits and what are the strengths in performance if we did do a fully dedicated lane in that area connecting straight through to Pasco County, so all that conservation land in North Hillsborough County. That would give us about 80% dedicated lanes to include that portion in the overall project. So that's alternative 3. Now we're also going to evaluate in isolation the opportunity to have dedicated lanes across the Howard Franklin Bridge. And we look at providing dedicated lanes across the Howard Franklin Bridge. Now we're looking at about 85% of the corridor being dedicated in terms of the FTA definition. And then ultimately, our last alternative, alternative 5, would be if we looked at the entire corridor and have a dedicated space all the way from St. Pete all the way to Wesley Chapel. So we are planning to have a series of community workshops starting in the beginning of December, in which we will take out this conversation about these 12 or 13 stations to the public. We want to also present some of these ideas about these alternatives. It's a great opportunity to get some really good, robust public community input and feedback, which will help inform us as we're actually developing the design concepts in Milestone 2 for those 5 alternatives. So really, that was it. I think the 5 alternatives really speak for themselves, really addressing the questions that we saw in the regional feasibility plan, moving those forward. And again, now we have the opportunity to start getting into the weeds, getting into the details on those 5 alternatives. What do the stations look like? What are the amenities at the stations? What does the alignment look like? And how do we get access to and from those stations? So, Mr. Chair, with that, I'll take any questions.
Any questions for Scott? Members? Cliff?
An alternate to Scott, the small gap in the northern part of the Wesley Chapel area that wasn't dedicated, what was the restraint there that created that?
The focus was effectively spot treatments at the major interchanges where we know that the traffic congestion is. So the focus under that alternative number 2, or the regional transit feasibility plan alternative, was to, where the congestion is, identify opportunity to avoid that congestion by using the dedicated lanes. So that's where you see that gap. It was the focus at the interchanges. But with alternative, I believe, alternative 3, we're going to look at filling those gaps and what are the pros and cons of doing that.
I just wondered if the northern gap might be looked at separately. I mean, that one area, so when you combine both those areas into a single review, I drive that area a lot, and the most congested area that would, benefit from it the most is if that northern area had that dedicated lane through that entire stretch.
Okay.
Even if the one below it might not ever be feasible in the
Okay.
initial phase.
Yeah.
It's just a point. I mean, it's fairly congested up there through that
No.
entire section.
No, I appreciate that. That's an excellent comment. We'll definitely look at that. Thank you.
Other members?
Yes.
Rich, did you have your hand up? Commissioner Campbell.
I was just trying to, I didn't get pre-briefed on this, I would have liked that, but, and I don't quite, you went through it very fast.
Sorry, my
So,
apologies.
in my mind, for me to absorb what exactly you were saying here. So, basically what you're saying is Bustle and Shoulder would not count at all as a dedicated lane, which I would never expect it to count as that, so that wouldn't be eligible for any kind of FTA transit funding match, correct?
Correct. So we're looking at the potential for either a new starts or a small starts application within the Capital Investment Grant Program, which is that FTA transit grant program. And for dedicated BRT, they do have policies as to what is constituted as dedicated versus not.
Okay. And what is dedicated, if you could go back to the slides, if you did,
Which one in particular? Sure.
well, a few of them.
Sure.
So if you go back to get what's classified as dedicated, you can look at express lanes, mixed traffic, or freeway BRT lanes. Is that the way that's
Yeah,
reads?
so this is the concept coming out of the Regional Transit Feasibility Plan. Those purple lines are where we're assuming there's dedicated transit lanes. That green section across the Howard Franklin Bridge was the concept of just using the express lanes that are being provided within the rebuilt Howard Franklin Bridge span. And then the blue in Pasco was actually in mixed traffic. And that's where we get the entire 41 miles. 60% of that would be dedicated, those purple lanes or lines on the map. And the requirement for FTA is 50% dedicated to the corridor to be eligible for dollars.
Okay, so in those areas, you would either have to have a totally set-aside lane, like where the purple is, and I'm sorry, I cannot see exactly the key there, but where the purple is, you're saying up there, that's it's a totally dedicated BRT lane.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And the green is what? Express lane?
express
okay,
lanes.
got it. And the blue is what?
Mixed traffic.
Mixed traffic,
So
okay.
that would be just like a traditional express bus.
And so the 60% comes from the purple and the green?
Just the purple.
Just the purple, okay. So, okay, I'm getting to see this more. And you have to have what percentage in order to be eligible for FTA?
50.
50. Okay, so then you're looking for anything over 50. Okay, so the other thing that I was I talked to a group of national experts. I was there talking to them, and I said, is there any place in the nation that you can name for me where they have a dedicated interstate lane for transit? And they all looked and searched their minds and said they could not think of anything. And about 10 minutes later, somebody said, I can think of one place in the country, and that's the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, where they have a lane set aside where buses go every 3 minutes. Otherwise, they couldn't think of a single place. And so I'm just wondering about this as a possibility, because you're putting it right through there where there's also huge objections in north of downtown, as you know, to Bears. There's huge objections by the community there about any proposed widenings and lane additions there. So I'm just wondering with regards to that and how that would work from downtown Tampa to the airport, set aside lane just for bus service that we're talking about every 15 minutes?
So I'll break down your question as you propose them. The first, regards to other national projects, there are a number of agencies, Georgia, Atlanta, the Georgia DOT is actually looking at a project to do this exact concept that we're talking about right now. It's in development. In Seattle, the Seattle Interstate 405 actually does have dedicated lanes that are partially built, and they're continuing to expand that system. So it does exist. I understand your comment, Commissioner, and this is a new concept on how you actually provide transit service. And really, I think it's a great opportunity to modernize our interstates, to bring them up to current standards and truly make them multimodal. And so I think that's an important aspect of it. In regards to your comment about the connection to the Heights neighborhood, what we're looking at does not require any widening whatsoever. It's just taking the shoulders that exist there today and making them a dedicated space for transit. So the intent is not to have any widening, especially in segment 7, which is that portion of the corridor. Really, we'd like to avoid any sort of right-of-way requirements, except for at the stations, along the entire corridor, because we do have this amazing opportunity to partner with the state to make that happen.
Well, I understand, but you said doesn't require any widening. That's, I don't believe, correct, is it?
Scott, I think maybe talking the same thing here, but can you explain what would make it not be bus on shoulder versus a dedicated lane that might be where the shoulder is?
Yeah, they actually use the same geographic space. It is the same physical space on the interstate. It's just the policy and how they're used. You can use that space, but if it's tied to the speeds of automobile traffic on the general purpose lanes, that's bus on shoulder. If you use that space, but you use it all day and it's not restricted to the speeds, that's dedicated definition within the FTA grant program, but it's using that shoulder. And within the TB Next program, the department has already gone through and included widening and hardening their shoulders as part of the TB Next program. So the point is we'd use that space, but instead of it being tied to the speeds on the automobile side, we would like to use it all day long.
Right, so typically our shoulders are constructed with a lesser amount of pavement because you don't run on it as much as you do in a regular, and they're usually not as wide as you would need for a dedicated lane. It might be 10 foot,
Correct.
and we may want to build a 15 foot so that you can run it. So it's really not adding a shoulder and an additional lane.
Correct.
It's just saying we're going to use this improved and widened shoulder as a bus lane as opposed to just being a shoulder that can be used when you want to bypass slowed traffic.
Right, correct,
So-
correct.
And that is how I understand it, but I just think as part of this conversation, it should be noted that a majority of the Hillsborough County Commission voted against on the tip, specifically that road widening through that area. While it takes no more right-of-way, they did not want, I don't want to see, and I think the community is very opposed to adding more road in that particular area. And so I'll just say with that, with the north of Fletcher or Fowler up through the blue area, that isn't that under capacity for some time to come?
For the segment north of Bears? I'd have to check and see at what point it becomes where it's, but it certainly isn't as critical. And because it goes through conservation lands, there's not much opportunity for like another interchange or but as continued traffic from Pasco County and north grows, I imagine at some point we might, I don't know if Ed, if you know off the top of the head when that segment might be considered to go over capacity? yeah, it's outside, it's not in the 20-year horizon.
Right.
But although I do believe, and I'd have to go back and check, but I thought in the MPO's LRTP, we do have the widening all the way up to Bears. That was approved by the MPO, and the segment between I-4 and north of Hillsborough Avenue is actually in the tip to be constructed starting in basically not this fiscal year, but the next fiscal year. So that improved shoulder, at least up to Hillsborough, should be in place starting construction in about 1.5 to 2 years. So, and we see this, you know, this was an option that was brought to us. We're going to look at the study. We obviously haven't made any predetermined, you know, what we will or won't allow, but we see it as an option. But I don't want it to come across that the department is saying that this option is better than an arterial BRT or a rail project at some point, but that it's just another tool that we have in our toolbox that we can use to hopefully create a system that is going to include rail, arterial BRT, but the freeway BRT, and in some places, express bus and express lanes can be a very successful option. The one in South Florida, I think we heard the presentations on those. They're moving as many people on the express lanes, express bus and express lanes in Broward and Dade County as they move currently on Sunrail. It's not saying that you got to be one or the other. It can be both, because they also have Tri-Rail and they have other things. So it's just a lower cost alternative that you can add into the transit mix. And we're going to fund a lot of it through highway funds, which helps to lower the cost for the transit project.
I'll just
And
say
Chair,
under that option, I think there'd be significant opposition. But
And if I may respond to that, Commissioner,
and-
we're very well aware of the concerns in the community, and we want to make sure we take our time to listen to the community and that we're effectively addressing their concerns. And I just want to be clear that the concept is not to widen at all, but maximize, provide a multimodal opportunity in what's already going to be out there.
No, it is to widen. So I think that should not be, it's not to take more right of way, but it is certainly to widen. So that's, you know, I think that's not the way that it should be put to the public, because that's not correct information. That is utterly not
Well,
accurate.
this project
There
would not be
wide-
focused on a widening.
There would be some widening of the pavement, but what we did was, and if you remember going back, and we've tried to be very sensitive to the community.
I
In
understand.
fact, you know, a few years ago, under the old TBX, we were going to be widening and putting express lanes on that segment through the Seminole Heights and north, and we were going to take 250 parcels at the downtown interchange. And as working with the community and as a compromise to try to find something that would both serve mobility needs and be responsive to community concerns, we were able to say, what we basically said is, we're not going to go outside our right-of-way, we're going to use our right-of-way the best that we can. And so, it's kind of a little semantics. Are we widening the road? We're widening the pavement. But from the people that are outside of the right-of-way, first they'll be getting sound walls, which they don't have now, which should help in some regards. But we want to use our right-of-way to the greatest extent that we can. And this option that they're talking about does stay within the existing right-of-way, which was our goal. We're not going to take any more property. We're not going to go and take parcels just to widen the road. So, you know, our position is that if it's within our right-of-way, we're going to try to maximize that as much as we can for passenger vehicles, for transit, for whatever we can get within that footprint. So, and we understand. I can tell you, we did hear a lot from the community in the Heights, in the urban core. We've also heard a lot from folks in Pasco County and North Tampa and other places, Pinellas County, that we hear a completely different viewpoint. And so I don't think it's fair to say that the whole community is against this type of a project. I think a segment, and quite honestly, a very vocal segment of the community is, but not necessarily to say it's just the whole community is against it. That's not what we hear in our meetings around the region.
And I have never said that.
Mr. Chair,
Just to be clear, too.
please, me too, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
we've got to kind of move on here too, but
I would like to just make, because this is also, we didn't have the other part of this presentation before, and it wasn't streamed. So just in terms of the stations too, just to be clear, when you didn't go through the stations this time, but again, I know you had one station that was located in Seminole Heights, Tampa Heights, and again, there are community objections to that. And I know that you said it was a low ridership station anyway, so, I'll just express that again. And also, as I had expressed before, any kind of, I think it would be misguided for us to do any infrastructure within the interstate in terms of,
We're getting beyond the scope
kind
of
of
our talk here, so let's move on.
Thank you,
There are a
Mr.
couple
Chair. I
of
have a
other
question.
Commissioner-
And I think you may have answered it, but on these BRT lanes, would it be possible that our van pool vans can also use that lane? Because I think that would be a real attractor. And I wonder if there's such a thing as private transit that could also take advantage of that.
There are some nuances to the way the FTA looks at the use of that lane and make sure that it's still compliant with their particular policy. I think when you start opening up the lane to too many other private providers, there's some concern that it might actually congest the lane and kind of work against the intent. But all along, for the last 2.5+ years, we've openly discussed the opportunity that BCPT, HART, PSTA are FTA transit services that can use that same corridor, which the regional project would be occurring every 10 minutes or more frequent, but yet you could have the 3 transit agencies also using that same exact corridor.
Commissioner Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just like, I don't have a question, Scott. I just have a comment that I would like to make for the good of the order. You know, I heard Mr. Lopano say that we have 5 million people in our region. This is a regional board. And I am just so passionate about the fact that we are so far behind in digging ourselves out of our congestion in this region. And I want to applaud your efforts, Scott,
Thank you.
and those of the Department of Transportation to make every effort to try to move us forward. To think that we can come up with a plan that will satisfy every person in that 5 million number is outrageous. And I want us to move forward and not get stuck because there's a certain few people who speak very loudly that are opposed to moving forward. I venture to say if we had to build Tampa International Airport today, the way it is today, we would never get it done. So I just felt compelled to say that because I know you've worked really, really, really hard, and I am very grateful for it and appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Members, any other questions? Because we need to move on.
Really, really quick one. In the cross-section for that dedicated lane for the bus, is there a paved shoulder requirement as well that the dedicated lane needs to have in addition to the space for the bus?
Yeah, we're working on the design criteria for that the envelope for the transit lane itself. And we're looking at, should it be a 12-foot bus lane with a 4-foot shoulder, or 3-foot shoulder? Is there a buffer requirement? Those are all things that we're going to discuss in Milestone 2. So that's exactly where we're headed.
And then the last thing for Scott, I understand the capacity issue, but I hope y'all don't rule out the possibility of private sector transit
Right.
in those lanes. I mean, that's kind of crazy to rule it out this early. I mean, there's a capacity issue there,
They can pay.
but it may be something to consider.
If you don't mind, I'd like
Yep.
to go back and do a little bit more research so I can address that question accurately.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
And my thinking is, for example, Raymond James is building a big office complex, Pasco County. And they also have a big office complex in Gateway. And they may like the idea of having their own bus that shuttles back and forth.
Right.
And maybe there's a fee to use that transit lane, but maybe Raymond James would like their own shuttle. I don't know if that's ever been done anywhere, but I'm just,
Potential P3 or joint venture with a
yeah,
private sector.
I'm just kind of making it up, but
I mean, if it's
think,
attractive and it works, I think the private sector would be interested.
yeah.
So,
Will do. I'll take a look at that and I'll report back.
thank you.
Thanks for that report. Moving on,
Sorry, Mr. Chair,
oh,
David, we were supposed to take an action, was this an action item today or an informational item?
What's the action?
Do we need an action on it?
I don't remember what the intent of today's update was.
It's under presentations on the
Okay.
agenda.
Fair enough.
What's the action?
Okay.
What's the action request?
I just want to make sure there's consensus on those 5 alternatives that we can carry into milestone 2.
I don't mind voting on it.
I don't mind taking action. Can we do
I'll
that,
take it.
Mr. Attorney? Sure. I would make a
Just have to take
motion.
public comment.
yeah, we have to take.
You can make a
Make a
motion.
motion and then,
You can make a motion, but then the chair will have to take public comment.
Well, I would like to make a motion that the 5 suggestions or alternatives be considered further and that we keep on refining and refining as we get more and more input, because I think I heard you say that we are planning to get a lot of public input,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
That's
That-
my motion.
I would
Mr. Chair.
second it, and I'd just like to include an alternative 2 behind you, the possibility that it might consider that northern section dedicated.
Will do. Thank you.
any public comment on this vote? Okay, none being heard. There's been a motion, a second. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.